In the quiet dignity of human endings, there are moments so profound they transcend the ordinary boundaries of legal proceedings and become sacred encounters with mortality, honor, and the deepest expressions of gratitude that the human heart can offer. Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom has witnessed countless stories of struggle and redemption, but none quite like the one that would unfold on a gray October morning when a dying veteran would deliver words of gratitude so powerful they would reduce a seasoned judge to tears and remind everyone present that some gestures of appreciation carry the weight of a lifetime's worth of meaning. 73-year-old William Bill Patterson sat in the courthouse waiting area, his frail body supported by a walker, but his posture still carrying traces of the military bearing that had defined him for most of his adult life. The Vietnam War veteran's appearance told the story of someone fighting a battle he knew he could not win. His once powerful frame had been reduced by months of chemotherapy and radiation treatments. His skin had the pallor that comes with serious illness, and his breathing required conscious effort in a way that spoke of lungs damaged by both Agent Orange exposure and the advancing cancer that was slowly claiming his life. The citation that brought Bill to Judge Caprio's courtroom was for a parking violation that had occurred during one of his frequent visits to the Providence VA Medical Center for treatment. At 73 and facing stage 4 lung cancer, Bill was spending 3 days a week at the hospital receiving chemotherapy, radiation therapy, and palliative care designed to extend his life by months rather than years. The parking citation represented not just an administrative violation, but the cruel irony of a man who had served his country with honor being penalized for seeking the medical care his military service had ultimately made necessary. Bill Patterson's journey to that courtroom bench had begun 54 years earlier when he was 19 years old and had received his draft notice during the height of the Vietnam conflict. Unlike many young men of his generation who sought deferments or fled to Canada to avoid military service, Bill had accepted his duty to serve with the quiet resignation of someone raised to believe that when your country called, you answered, without question or complaint. He had reported to basic training at Fort Benning with the same sense of responsibility that had guided most of his life decisions, never imagining that his military service would ultimately lead to the medical crisis that now defined his daily existence. Bill's 13 months in Vietnam had been spent with the 25th Infantry Division, operating in some of the most dangerous regions of South Vietnam during 1970 and 1971. He had been a radio operator, a position that required him to accompany infantry patrols into hostile territory while carrying equipment that made him a prime target for enemy snipers who understood the tactical importance of disrupting communications between field units and their commanders. The job had been both essential and extraordinarily dangerous, requiring Bill to maintain radio contact with headquarters while under fire, coordinate medical evacuations for wounded soldiers, and provide critical communication links during combat operations. During his tour of duty, Bill had been exposed to Agent Orange and other chemical defoliants that the U.S. military had used extensively throughout Vietnam to remove jungle cover and destroy crops that might support enemy forces. At the time, neither Bill nor his fellow soldiers had been warned about the long-term health consequences of exposure to these chemicals. They had been told the substances were harmless to humans and had worked and lived in areas that had been heavily sprayed without any protective equipment or special precautions. Bill had returned home from Vietnam in December 1971, carrying with him not just the visible reminders of his service, a Purple Heart earned when shrapnel from a mortar attack had left permanent scars on his left arm and back, but also the invisible wounds that would take decades to fully manifest. Like many Vietnam veterans, he had struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life after the intensity and danger of combat operations. Despite these challenges, Bill had worked hard to build a meaningful life after his military service. He had used the GI Bill to attend Rhode Island College, earning a degree in education before spending 32 years as a high school history teacher in the Cranston school system. His students had known him as Mr. Patterson, a demanding but fair instructor who brought unusual passion and knowledge to his lessons about American history, particularly the units covering the Vietnam War era that he had lived through as a young soldier. Bill had married his college sweetheart, Patricia, in 1974, and together they had raised 2 children, Michael, now 47 and working as an engineer in California, and Sarah, 44 and a nurse practitioner in Boston. The Patterson family had lived quiet, productive lives in a modest colonial house in Cranston, where Bill had spent weekends working in his garden, coaching youth baseball, and volunteering with local veterans organizations that helped other former service members navigate the complex process of applying for VA benefits and medical care. The first signs of the illness that would ultimately claim Bill's life had appeared 3 years earlier when he began experiencing persistent coughing and shortness of breath that gradually worsened despite treatment for what doctors initially assumed was bronchitis or a respiratory infection. When chest X-rays finally revealed shadows on his lungs that led to more comprehensive testing, the diagnosis had been devastating. Stage 3 lung cancer that pathology reports linked directly to his Agent Orange exposure during his Vietnam service. The connection between Bill's cancer and his military service had been officially recognized by the Department of Veterans Affairs, qualifying him for full medical coverage and disability benefits that helped offset the enormous costs of his treatment. But the recognition had come with the bitter irony that it represented acknowledgement of a debt that could never truly be repaid. His government had finally admitted that his military service had exposed him to chemicals that were now killing him. But that admission came too late to prevent or cure the disease that was steadily destroying his lungs. The parking citation that had brought Bill to court had been issued during a particularly difficult period in his treatment when the side effects of chemotherapy had made him weak and disoriented. He had arrived at the VA Medical Center for a morning appointment that had stretched into the afternoon due to complications that required additional monitoring and treatment. When he finally returned to his car 6 hours later, exhausted from his treatment and struggling with the nausea that accompanied his chemotherapy regimen, he found the bright orange citation tucked under his windshield wiper. The $45 fine represented more than just money to Bill. It felt like another small injustice added to the larger injustice of developing cancer from chemicals his own government had exposed him to during his military service. He had paid thousands of dollars in parking fees at the VA hospital over the past 3 years, money that came out of his fixed retirement income and represented a significant expense for someone living on a teacher's pension and Social Security benefits. But Bill's decision to appear in court to contest the parking citation wasn't motivated primarily by the money or even by a sense of unfairness about the ticket. At 73 and facing the final stages of a terminal illness, Bill had developed a clarity about what mattered most in the time he had remaining, and high on that list was the desire to be treated with the dignity and respect that he felt should be accorded to someone who had served his country honorably and was now suffering the consequences of that service. As Bill sat in the courthouse waiting for his case to be called, he reflected on the irony of spending some of his precious remaining time dealing with a parking ticket when he could be at home with Patricia, tending to the garden they had worked on together for 47 years, or writing letters to his children and grandchildren that would help them remember him after he was gone. But he had also made peace with the decision to appear in court, understanding that sometimes standing up for principle mattered more than convenience, even when time was running out. The Bill Patterson who sat in the courthouse that October morning was a man transformed by the proximity of mortality, carrying within him a perspective that only comes to those who have faced death in combat and now faced it again in the sterile corridors of cancer treatment centers. His journey from the jungles of Vietnam to the classroom of Cranston High School to the oncology ward of the Providence VA Medical Center had been marked by a quiet determination to find meaning and purpose in every stage of his life, even as that life was being slowly claimed by the very chemicals his government had assured him were safe. The diagnosis of lung cancer 3 years earlier had not come as a complete surprise to Bill, who had been watching fellow Vietnam veterans succumb to various cancers and illnesses linked to Agent Orange exposure with increasing frequency over the past decade. He had lost his closest friend from his Army unit, Tommy Rodriguez, to liver cancer 2 years before his own diagnosis, and had served as a pallbearer at funerals for 3 other members of his old squad who had developed cancers that the VA had eventually linked to their chemical exposure in Southeast Asia. When Dr. Sarah Chen at the VA Medical Center had delivered Bill's diagnosis, she had done so with the gentle professionalism of someone who had given similar news to hundreds of veterans over her career. The cancer was advanced, she explained, likely having been developing undetected for several years before symptoms appeared. The treatment options were limited but not non-existent. Aggressive chemotherapy and radiation therapy might extend his life by months or possibly years, though the side effects would be severe and the ultimate outcome was not in doubt. Bill's response to the diagnosis had been characteristic of the quiet dignity he had maintained throughout his life. He had asked practical questions about treatment schedules and prognosis, had discussed the financial implications with Patricia, and had made the decision to pursue aggressive treatment not because he harbored illusions about beating the cancer, but because he wanted to maximize the time he had left with his family and continue his work with local veterans organizations for as long as possible. The 3 years of treatment that followed had been marked by the peculiar rhythm that defines the lives of terminal cancer patients, periods of relative stability interrupted by crises that required hospitalization, adjustments to medication regimens that created new side effects to manage, and the constant presence of medical appointments that gradually became the organizing principle around which all other activities had to be arranged. Patricia had been Bill's constant companion throughout his illness, driving him to treatments when he was too weak to drive himself, managing his complex medication schedule, and maintaining the facade of normalcy that both of them needed to get through each day. Their 49-year marriage had been tested by many challenges over the decades, but nothing had prepared them for the particular cruelty of watching Agent Orange slowly claim the life of the man who had survived enemy fire in Vietnam only to be poisoned by his own government's chemicals. The parking citation that had brought Bill to court had been issued on a day when his treatment had been particularly difficult. He had arrived at the VA Medical Center at 8 in the morning for what was supposed to be a routine chemotherapy session, but complications with his IV line had required multiple attempts to establish access, and adverse reactions to his medications had required extended monitoring that kept him in the treatment center until well past 3 in the afternoon. Bill had purchased a parking pass that was valid until 1 o'clock, having learned from experience to budget extra time for his appointments. But when his treatment had extended beyond that time frame due to medical complications, he had been faced with the choice of leaving his treatment incomplete or accepting the risk of receiving a citation. For someone whose cancer was being caused by chemicals his government had exposed him to during military service, the decision to prioritize his medical care over parking regulations had seemed both obvious and bitterly ironic. The $45 fine that resulted from that choice represented more than just money to Bill and Patricia, who were living on his teacher's pension and Social Security benefits while managing the out-of-pocket medical expenses that even VA coverage didn't eliminate. Every month brought co-payments for prescription medications, costs for medical equipment not covered by insurance, and transportation expenses for the 3 times weekly trips to the medical center that had become the rhythm of Bill's remaining life. But beyond the financial burden, the parking citation represented something deeper and more painful. Another small reminder that the system he had served with honor often seemed indifferent to the sacrifices he had made and the price he was continuing to pay for his service. Bill had spent 54 years watching his government slowly acknowledge the health consequences of Agent Orange exposure, had seen fellow veterans die while waiting for recognition of their service-connected illnesses, and had experienced firsthand the bureaucratic obstacles that often stood between sick veterans and the care they deserved. Despite these frustrations, Bill had never developed the bitterness or anger that consumed some veterans who felt betrayed by their governments. Handling of Agent Orange issues. His perspective had been shaped by his 3 decades as a teacher, during which he had worked with thousands of young people who needed to believe in the possibility of justice and fairness even when the world often seemed to demonstrate the opposite. Bill had maintained his faith in American institutions not because they were perfect, but because he believed they were capable of growth and improvement when confronted with their failures. This philosophical approach to his circumstances had guided Bill's decision to contest the parking citation rather than simply paying the fine and moving on. At 73 and facing terminal illness, he could easily have chosen to avoid the stress and effort required to appear in court, but he felt that his case represented an opportunity to educate others about the challenges faced by sick veterans, and to advocate for more compassionate treatment of people dealing with service-connected medical issues. The morning of his court appearance, Bill had dressed carefully in his best suit, the same dark blue one he had worn to awards ceremonies, during his teaching career and to funerals for fellow veterans over the past several years. Patricia had helped him with his tie, her hands shaking slightly as she performed the familiar task, both of them aware that occasions requiring formal dress were becoming increasingly rare in Bill's shortened timeline. The drive to the courthouse had been difficult, with Bill's breathing requiring frequent stops and Patricia's anxiety about his condition creating tension that both of them tried to hide from the other. They had arrived early, knowing that Bill's physical limitations would require extra time to navigate the courthouse building and find appropriate seating that would accommodate his walker and his need to remain close to restroom facilities. As they sat together in the courthouse waiting area, Bill had reflected on the strange turns his life had taken, from teenage farm boy to infantry soldier to teacher to cancer patient to courthouse defendant. Each phase had brought its own challenges and rewards, but all had been united by his fundamental belief that service to others and respect for institutions were the foundation of a meaningful life, even when those institutions sometimes failed to live up to their highest ideals. The other defendants waiting their turns that morning seemed to Bill to represent the full spectrum of human experience. Young people making mistakes they would hopefully learn from, middle-aged people dealing with the complications of busy lives, elderly people struggling with systems that had grown more complex than their ability to navigate them successfully. Bill felt a kinship with all of them, understanding that everyone who appeared in court was dealing with some form of challenge or crisis that had brought them into contact with the justice system. When Patricia squeezed his hand gently as they waited, Bill squeezed back with what strength he had, both of them drawing comfort from the physical connection that had sustained them through 49 years of marriage and would continue to sustain them through whatever time remained. They didn't speak much as they waited, having learned over the past 3 years that sometimes the most profound communication happened in silence, through touch and presence, rather than words. "William Patterson," the court clerk announced, and Bill slowly rose from his seat, his movements careful and deliberate as he gripped his walker for support. Patricia stood beside him, ready to offer assistance if needed, but respecting his desire to approach the bench with as much independence as his condition allowed. Together they made their way toward Judge Caprio, Bill's measured steps echoing softly in the courtroom that had grown noticeably quieter as people recognized they were witnessing someone for whom this simple act of walking required significant effort and determination. Judge Caprio looked up as they approached, immediately recognizing the signs of serious illness in Bill's appearance and the devoted support evident in Patricia's protective presence beside her husband. In his decades of experience, the judge had developed a sensitivity to the particular vulnerability of elderly defendants dealing with health issues, and something about Bill Patterson's dignity in the face of obvious physical challenges commanded both attention and respect. "Good morning, Mr. Patterson," Judge Caprio said gently, his voice automatically adopting the patient, respectful tone he used when addressing elderly defendants. "Please take your time, and let me know if you need to sit down at any point during our conversation." Bill looked directly at the judge, his eyes still bright despite the fatigue that marked his features. "Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate your consideration." His voice, though weakened by illness, carried the clear diction of someone accustomed to public speaking from his years in the classroom. Judge Caprio glanced at the citation before him, noting the parking violation at the VA Medical Center, then looked back at Bill with increased attention. "Mr. Patterson, I see you received this citation at the Providence VA Medical Center. Can you tell me about the circumstances?" Bill straightened slightly, drawing on reserves of strength that seemed to come from the importance he placed on telling his story clearly and completely. "Your Honor, I'm a Vietnam veteran receiving treatment for lung cancer that the VA has determined is connected to my Agent Orange exposure during my service. I was at the medical center for chemotherapy treatment that ran longer than expected, due to medical complications." The mention of Agent Orange and service-connected cancer immediately captured Judge Caprio's full attention. As someone who had deep respect for veterans and understanding of the particular challenges they faced, he recognized that this was not a typical parking violation case. "Mr. Patterson, first let me thank you for your service to our country," Judge Caprio said with genuine reverence. "Can you tell me more about your military service and your current medical situation?" Bill's posture grew more erect as he prepared to discuss his military background, the pride in his service evident. Despite his physical condition, "I served 13 months in Vietnam with the 25th Infantry Division from 1970 to 1971, Your Honor. I was a radio operator, which required me to work in areas that were heavily sprayed with Agent Orange and other chemical defoliants. I received a Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat." Judge Caprio felt his throat tighten with emotion as he heard this account of service and sacrifice. "And your current health condition is related to that service?" "Yes, Your Honor," Bill replied, his voice growing softer but no less clear. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer that the Department of Veterans Affairs has officially recognized as being caused by my Agent Orange exposure. I'm currently receiving palliative treatment at the VA Medical Center 3 times a week. The courtroom had grown completely silent as everyone present absorbed the profound implications of what Bill was sharing. Here was a man who had served his country in combat, been wounded in that service, and was now dying from chemicals his own government had exposed him to, appearing in court to contest a parking ticket he had received while seeking treatment for his service-connected illness. Judge Caprio removed his glasses and wiped his eyes, no longer concerned with maintaining judicial composure in the face of such a heartbreaking situation. "Mr. Patterson, help me understand what happened the day you received this citation." Bill's explanation came with the methodical precision of someone who had thought carefully about every detail. "Your Honor, I arrived at the medical center at 8 in the morning for what was scheduled to be a 3-hour chemotherapy session. I purchased a parking pass valid until 1 o'clock. However, my treatment was complicated by problems with my IV access and adverse reactions to my medications, which required extended monitoring." He paused to catch his breath before continuing. "The medical staff couldn't predict these complications, and I certainly couldn't leave my treatment incomplete. When I finally returned to my car at 3:30 in the afternoon, I found the citation. I understand that the parking regulations don't make exceptions for medical emergencies, but I felt that the circumstances warranted an explanation." Judge Caprio felt his heart breaking as he listened to this account of a dying veteran receiving a parking ticket while enduring chemotherapy treatment for a disease caused by his military service. The injustice of the situation seemed overwhelming, and he struggled to maintain his composure. Mr. Patterson, the judge said, his voice thick with emotion, how are you managing your treatments in your daily life? Bill glanced at Patricia before answering, drawing strength from her presence. My wife, Patricia, has been my constant companion and caregiver throughout this illness, Your Honor. We've been married for 49 years, and she drives me to all my appointments, manages my medications, and provides the support that makes it possible for me to continue my treatments. Patricia, who had been standing quietly beside her husband, felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she heard Bill acknowledge her role in his care. The strain of the past 3 years had been enormous for both of them, but she had never questioned her commitment to seeing him through this final battle. Judge Caprio turned his attention to Patricia with the same respect he had shown her husband. Mrs. Patterson, this must be incredibly difficult for both of you. How are you holding up under these circumstances? Patricia's voice was soft but clear as she responded. Your Honor, Bill is the strongest, most honorable man I've ever known. If caring for him during his illness is the last gift I can give him after all the years he's given to his students, his community, and his country, then it's a privilege, not a burden. The raw love and devotion in Patricia's words seemed to resonate through the courtroom, touching everyone present who recognized they were witnessing the kind of profound partnership that sustained people through life's greatest challenges. Judge Caprio felt his own emotional response intensifying as he processed not just Bill's individual story, but what it represented about the broader treatment of veterans dealing with service-connected illnesses. Mr. Patterson, beyond this specific citation, how have you found the process of dealing with bureaucratic systems while managing your illness? Bill's answer reflected the measured wisdom of someone who had spent decades working within institutional systems as an educator. Your Honor, I understand that systems and regulations exist for good reasons, and I don't expect special treatment because of my condition. But I do hope for understanding when circumstances beyond my control, particularly medical emergencies related to my service-connected illness, result in technical violations of regulations. He paused, gathering strength for what he seemed to recognize would be the most important part of his testimony. I appeared in court today not just to contest this citation, but because I believe that how we treat our most vulnerable citizens, including sick and dying veterans, reflects our values as a society. Judge Caprio sat in stunned silence for several moments after Bill finished speaking, the weight of what he had heard settling over the courtroom like a sacred presence that demanded reverence and reflection. In 3 decades of presiding over municipal court, he had encountered countless stories of hardship and injustice, but nothing had prepared him for the profound moral clarity of a dying veteran who had come to court not seeking pity or special treatment, but simply asking for the recognition of his humanity and dignity in the face of circumstances that would have broken lesser men. When Judge Caprio finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion and filled with the kind of righteous indignation that comes from witnessing institutional failures that wound the very people institutions are meant to protect. Mr. Patterson, he began, his voice barely controlled, what you have shared with me today represents one of the most heartbreaking and yet inspiring accounts I have ever heard in this courtroom. The judge stood up from his bench, a gesture that immediately commanded the attention of everyone present and signified that something extraordinary was about to unfold. His movement wasn't just formal protocol, it was a sign of respect for someone whose sacrifice and dignity had transformed a routine hearing into a moment of profound moral reckoning. Mr. Patterson, I want everyone in this courtroom to understand what we are witnessing here today, Judge Caprio said, his voice rising with passion and conviction. We have before us a man who answered his country's call to service as a teenager, who served with honor in one of the most dangerous positions in the Vietnam War, who was wounded in combat defending the freedoms we all enjoy, and who is now dying from chemicals his own government exposed him to during that service. The judge's words seemed to resonate through the courtroom, touching everyone present who suddenly understood they were witnessing not just a legal proceeding, but a moment that illuminated fundamental questions about how society treats its most vulnerable heroes. Furthermore, Judge Caprio continued, his emotion becoming more visible with each word, this man received a parking citation while undergoing chemotherapy treatment for his service-connected cancer, and instead of becoming bitter or angry, he came to court today with dignity and grace to explain his circumstances and advocate not just for himself, but for all veterans facing similar challenges. Bill stood quietly, overwhelmed by the judge's passionate advocacy, but also humbled by the recognition that his individual story was being used to represent the struggles of countless other veterans who had made similar sacrifices without similar recognition. Judge Caprio returned to his seat but continued speaking with unprecedented emotion. Mr. Patterson, I am not only dismissing this citation completely, but I want to do something that I have never done before in this courtroom. The judge reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small American flag, one of several he kept for special occasions, and stood to present it to Bill personally. Mr. Patterson, this flag represents the gratitude of every American citizen for your service and sacrifice. It also represents my personal promise that your story will not be forgotten, and that your advocacy for better treatment of sick and dying veterans will continue beyond this courtroom. Bill accepted the flag with hands that trembled not from weakness, but from the overwhelming emotion of receiving such recognition. For someone who had spent 54 years watching his government slowly acknowledge the health consequences of Agent Orange exposure, this moment of immediate recognition and respect was almost too much to bear. But Judge Caprio was far from finished with his unprecedented response to Bill's case. Mr. Patterson, I want you to give my office your contact information because I'm going to personally reach out to officials at the Providence VA Medical Center to discuss how we can prevent other sick veterans from facing similar parking citations while receiving life-saving medical care. The practical nature of this commitment, the promise of systemic change that could help other veterans avoid Bill's experience, seemed to move Bill even more than the personal recognition he was receiving. Throughout his illness, he had worried constantly about the other veterans who were fighting similar battles without the support systems and advocacy that had sustained him. Your Honor, Bill said, his voice stronger than it had been all morning, what you're doing today means more to me than you can possibly know, but I want you to understand something important. He paused, gathering strength for what seemed to be the most significant statement he would make. I didn't come here today seeking special treatment or looking for sympathy, Bill continued, his words carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of reflection on service, sacrifice, and gratitude. I came here because I believe that how we treat our most vulnerable citizens reflects our values as a society. But I also came here to say something that I may not have many more opportunities to say. The courtroom grew completely silent as everyone present sensed that Bill was preparing to deliver words of particular significance and meaning. Bill's voice grew stronger and more clear as he prepared to speak what would become his final public statement about his military service and his gratitude for the life he had been given. Your Honor, I want you and everyone in this courtroom to know that despite everything I've endured, the combat, the wounds, the chemical exposure, the cancer, and yes, even this parking ticket, I have never for one moment regretted my decision to serve my country. The profound simplicity and power of this statement seemed to hit everyone present like a physical force. The recognition that a man who was literally dying from the consequences of his military service could still express gratitude for the opportunity to have served. I have been blessed to live in the greatest country on earth, Bill continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his conviction. I was blessed to serve alongside the finest men I have ever known. I was blessed to come home when so many of my friends did not. I was blessed to have a career teaching young people about the history and principles that make this country worth defending. And I was blessed to have 49 years of marriage to the most wonderful woman in the world. Patricia was now crying. openly, as were many others in the courtroom, but Bill's words were not finished. "Most of all, Your Honor, I have been blessed to live in a country where a dying veteran can walk into a courtroom and be treated with dignity and respect by a judge who sees past a simple citation to recognize the human being standing before him." Judge Caprio felt his own composure finally break completely as he heard these words of gratitude from a man who had every reason to be bitter and angry, but had chosen instead to focus on blessings and appreciation. The veteran's final words represented everything the judge believed about justice, compassion, and the fundamental dignity that should be accorded to every human being, especially those who had sacrificed so much for others. "Mr. Patterson," Judge Caprio said through his tears, "your words today have reminded me why I chose to work in public service, and why treating every person who comes before me with dignity and respect is not just good law, but good humanity. You honor us with your presence, your service, and your incredible grace in the face of circumstances that would defeat most people." The standing ovation that erupted in the courtroom was unlike anything that had ever been witnessed in a municipal court proceeding, with everyone present, defendants, court officers, clerks, and spectators, rising to their feet to honor a dying veteran whose words had transformed a simple hearing into a profound meditation on service, sacrifice, and the enduring power of gratitude. The impact of Bill Patterson's extraordinary words of gratitude rippled far beyond the walls of Judge Caprio's courtroom that October morning, creating waves of reflection and action that would touch countless lives and ultimately change how the Providence VA Medical Center approached parking policies for seriously ill veterans. As word of his remarkable testimony spread through the veteran community and eventually across social media platforms, Bill's story became a powerful reminder that true heroism often lies not in avoiding suffering, but in maintaining grace and gratitude in the face of life's greatest challenges. The immediate response to Bill's court appearance was overwhelming in its scope and sincerity. Judge Caprio, true to his word, contacted the administration of the Providence VA Medical Center that very afternoon to discuss Bill's case and explore solutions that would prevent other seriously ill veterans from facing similar parking citations while receiving life-saving medical care. The conversation that followed led to the implementation of new policies that provided extended parking validation for patients experiencing medical complications that delayed their treatments beyond scheduled timeframes. But the changes went beyond practical policy adjustments. Bill's story had touched something deep in the collective consciousness of people who heard it, inspiring renewed conversations about how society honors and cares for its veterans, particularly those suffering from service-connected illnesses. The video of his court appearance, which captured both his dignified testimony and Judge Caprio's emotional response, was viewed millions of times and shared by veterans' organizations, healthcare advocates, and ordinary citizens who were moved by his example of grace under pressure. In the weeks following his court appearance, Bill and Patricia found themselves at the center of an outpouring of support and recognition that surprised them with its intensity and geographic scope. Letters arrived from around the country, written by fellow veterans, military families, and citizens who wanted Bill to know that his service was remembered and appreciated. Local veterans organizations honored him at ceremonies he was still well enough to attend, and the Rhode Island legislature passed a resolution recognizing his service and sacrifice. But perhaps more meaningful to Bill than the public recognition was the private impact his story had on individual veterans who reached out to share their own experiences with service-connected illnesses and to thank him for giving voice to struggles they had faced in isolation. His testimony had helped other veterans feel less alone in their battles with bureaucracy and illness and had encouraged some to pursue benefits and recognition they had previously been too proud or discouraged to seek. The relationship that developed between Bill and Judge Caprio in the months following the court appearance became one of mutual respect and genuine friendship. The judge called periodically to check on Bill's condition and to update him on the policy changes his case had inspired at the VA Medical Center. More importantly, Judge Caprio had begun incorporating Bill's story into his speaking engagements, using the veteran's example to illustrate how the justice system could serve not just legal functions, but moral and educational purposes when guided by compassion and wisdom. 3 months after his court appearance, Bill's condition had deteriorated significantly, but his spirits remained remarkably strong. During one of Judge Caprio's visits to the Patterson home, Bill had insisted on showing the judge his garden, where he continued to work despite his declining strength, because as he explained, growing things gives me hope, and hope is what keeps you human when everything else is falling apart. The judge found himself profoundly moved by Bill's continued focus on growth and possibility, even as his own life was ending. Their conversations during these visits ranged from Bill's memories of his students and his pride in their achievements, to his reflections on the meaning of service and sacrifice, to his hopes for Patricia's future after he was gone. Through these discussions, Judge Caprio gained insights into aging, mortality, and the sources of meaning that sustain people through life's final chapters. Bill Patterson passed away peacefully at home on a cold January morning, surrounded by Patricia, his children, Michael and Sarah, and several close friends from his teaching career and military service. His final weeks had been marked by the same grace and gratitude that had characterized his court appearance, with visitors often leaving his bedside feeling inspired rather than saddened by their interactions with a man who faced death with the same courage he had brought to every other challenge in his life. Judge Caprio delivered the eulogy at Bill's funeral, speaking to a packed church about the veteran's remarkable character and the lessons his life offered about service, sacrifice, and the power of maintaining gratitude even in the face of profound injustice. Bill Patterson taught me that, true, heroism isn't about avoiding suffering, the judge told the assembled mourners. It's about choosing how you respond to suffering when it comes. He could have been bitter about the chemicals that caused his cancer, angry about the government policies that exposed him to those chemicals, or resentful about the parking ticket that brought him to my courtroom. Instead, he chose gratitude for the opportunity to serve, appreciation for the life he'd been given, and concern for other veterans who might face similar challenges. The William Patterson Memorial Fund, established by Judge Caprio and the Providence Veterans Administration, provided financial assistance for parking and transportation costs for seriously ill veterans receiving treatment at VA medical facilities. The fund grew rapidly through donations from people who had been moved by Bill's story, and within its first year it had helped over 200 veterans and their families manage the practical costs associated with seeking medical care for service-connected illnesses. But Bill's most enduring legacy was not institutional or financial. It was the example he had set of how to maintain dignity, grace, and gratitude even when facing circumstances that would have justified bitterness and despair. His story became part of the curriculum at several military academies and veterans counseling programs, used to illustrate the values that should guide military service and the attitudes that could sustain veterans through the challenges they might face long after their active duty ended. Patricia, who had been Bill's devoted companion through 49 years of marriage and 3 years of terminal illness, found comfort in the knowledge that his final public act had been one of service to other veterans who were fighting similar battles. She continued to attend veterans events and support group meetings, sharing Bill's story and message of gratitude with other military families who were dealing with service-connected illnesses and the bureaucratic challenges that often accompanied them. 2 years after Bill's death, Judge Caprio established an annual lecture series at Rhode Island College's Education Department, where Bill had earned his teaching degree decades earlier. The William Patterson Memorial Lecture on Service and Citizenship brought prominent speakers to campus to discuss the relationship between military service, civic responsibility, and the values that sustain democratic societies. The first lecture was delivered by Judge Caprio himself, who spoke about how Bill's example had influenced his own approach to public service and judicial responsibility. The parking citation that had brought Bill Patterson to Judge Caprio's courtroom had seemed like a minor administrative annoyance, one more bureaucratic obstacle in a life already complicated by terminal illness and the daily challenges of managing his medical care. But in the hands of a man who understood that every interaction was an opportunity to demonstrate the values he had lived by, and in the presence of a judge who recognized that justice should serve humanity rather than merely process violations, that simple citation became the catalyst for a moment of profound moral education that continued to inspire and instruct long after both men's voices had been stilled. Bill Patterson's final words of gratitude had done more than move a courtroom to tears. They had reminded everyone who heard them that the highest form of patriotism lies not in avoiding criticism of one's country, but in continuing to believe in its potential for goodness and justice, even when personal experience provides ample reason for cynicism. His legacy lived on in the policy changes his case had inspired, the veterans his story had helped, and most importantly, in the example he had set of how to maintain hope and gratitude even when facing life's greatest challenges with courage, dignity, and an unshakable faith in the fundamental decency of human beings when they are called upon to recognize and honor the best in each other.